In this video, we talk about exile and Hellenization. What we're doing is dealing with the culture and context that stand behind the culture and context of the New Testament. So what we're going to be doing is giving a sort of flyover approach to the Israelite and the Judean experience of exile. Some of the material that we're going to address in this video is likely familiar to you from other classes, particularly your Old Testament class, but reviewing material is never a bad thing. So once again, we're dealing with the history and cultural and religious context of the New Testament by stepping behind the context of the New Testament and seeing the influences that led to that context into which the New Testament texts were written. And I want to give you a fair warning at the very beginning of this video is I'm going to make some cultural references to Star Wars and Harry Potter characters and lore. So for those of you who know these well, hopefully this will be a helpful connection. For those of you who don't know this well, what I'm going to ask you to do here is do a lecture pause the lecture, go ahead and watch all of the Star Wars films in the correct order, starting with number 4, and then do the same for Harry Potter. Then once you're done with that, it should only take you a week or so. Come back to the lecture and resume it. I'm just kidding. The actual lecture pause here is to make a prediction or make a guess, or perhaps in some cases recall information about the 5 following empires. So what I want you to do is put them in chronological order of which came first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. And if you don't know this, that's totally fine. I'm not, the purpose of this is not to get you to give the right answer. The purpose of doing this is to make a guess. We will often do this in lecture pauses for this class. I'll ask you to pause, take a guess about something. And the reason for that is that neurologically, if we make a guess and correct it or are confirmed in our guess, we are much more likely to remember that information. So the purpose of this is to really get this information to sort of stick in your head insofar as we're going to be addressing these empires. So this lecture pause should only take you a minute or so. Pause the lecture, make a guess about the chronological order of these 5 empires. To make sure that we're all on the same page about exile, I give us a definition of exile here. And what we're going to see is that there are times when Israel and Judea or Judeans are in fact in a situation of exile as technically defined here. They are expelled from their land and they are living in another place. However, there's also times when Israel and Judeans are not technically in a situation of exile, but there still are imperial sort of forces that are pressuring their identity. And even in the New Testament context, you'll often hear people say that the Jews thought of themselves as in a situation of exile, even though there was a temple standing, and even though they were living in their land, that there were, because of Greek and Roman incursions, cultural incursions, that Jews understood themselves to be in exile in this time period. And so what we're going to do here is talk about the different situations of exile in the technical sense and in the non-technical sense. But to do that, we first need to talk about the sort of historical Israel under King David. So under King David and under Solomon before him, the 12 tribes of Israel were united. So we think of sort of ancient Israel as this loose confederation of 12 different tribes occupying what we would now call the Holy Land, that become united under David, Saul, and Solomon. So that we have this Davidic and Israelite monarchy at its greatest extent under King David. But this doesn't last for all that long. That the period of the United Monarchy is really less than a century before the monarchy divides into 2 groups, into northern Israel and southern Judah. And this is where we're going to get terms Israelite and Judean from. And once the monarchy is divided, this is where we really start to see the imperial incursions from Israel's neighbors. So the first in our list of empires is the Assyrian Empire. And here is where the Star Wars reference comes in. We can think of the Assyrian Empire as the sort of original empire, the original enemies of the Israelites, who in 722 BCE came into the northern kingdom of Israel and took it over. And so visually we can depict this way. We have Israel in the north, we have Judah in the south. Assyria takes over the northern kingdom in 722 BCE and is sort of knocking on the door of the southern kingdom. Jerusalem is located in Judah. The temple is located in Judah. And Assyria is trying to take over the capital city of Jerusalem, but ultimately fails to do so. So we still, at this point, have a king, an Israelite king in Judah under the Assyrian Empire. And eventually, the Assyrian Empire is going to fall and crumble. And out of the ashes of this Assyrian Empire, a new order is going to arise. And this is the Babylonian Empire. And the important date that you probably are well aware of is 587 or 586 BCE, when Jerusalem does in fact fall to a new empire. So if we depict Assyria taking over the northern empire like this, we have the Babylonians coming in 587, 586 BCE, taking over the entirety of Israel and Judah, and sending Judeans into exile to live in Babylon, to live in a land that is not their own. So at this point, Judeans are not living in their own land, and they, of course, no longer have a king in the line of. And if we have our first two empires out here, and we have our sort of enemies of the Israelite and the Judean people, we need our next enemy of the Israelite or the Judean people. And in this case, we are going to have our enemy in the form of Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers represents the Persians, who took a sort of different tack from the Assyrians and the Babylonians, where the Assyrians and the Babylonians forcefully overcame people and sort of imposed their will onto the Israelite and the Judean people. The Persian Empire took a little bit different tack. Once the Persians took over the Babylonians, they allowed Judeans to go back to Judah and to rebuild Jerusalem and the temples. This is why we get, the kindly Mr. Rogers, the Presbyterian minister, as our image here. And this is not to suggest that everything the Persian Empire did was good and benevolent. Far from the case, but it gives us that image to associate with allowing the Judeans to go back and rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. And so to map Mr. Rogers onto our map here, we have him controlling the Persians controlling the Holy Land, but allowing the Judeans to live in the Holy Land and re-establish themselves there. So Judeans go out of exile in Babylon and are able to live in Jerusalem, in the capital city. But one of the stipulations of the Persian Empire is that you can go back, but you can't have your own king. So there still is no king under the Persians. And once again, nations rise and empires fall. The Persian empires fall and the Greek Empire rises. And we're going to have two sort of different sub-Greek empires, we might think of them as, with the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And our figure for one of our readings this week, Alexander the Great. So we have Alexander sort of taking over the Persian Empire and taking a similar tact with respect to the Judeans, as did the Persians, allowing them to continue to live in the land, to be in Jerusalem and Judah and have their temple and do worship there for some time. Though this is going to later change, but the Greek Ptolemies, after Alexander the Great dies, Alexander leaves no heir, and so his kingdom is sort of divided up. And we have the Greek Ptolemies and the Greek Seleucids. So here's the Persian Empire sort of at the extent of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE. Alexander dies, and the empire is sort of divided between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies here in the south, the Seleucids in the north. And you can see how Jerusalem, as has often been the case, is situated sort of at the borderlands of different empires. And by being situated at the borderlands of an empire, it makes it sort of a fraught zone. And so what we see is the Greek Ptolemies sort of take the same tack that the Persians and Alexander the Great did with respect to Jerusalem and worship in the temple, and allowing Jews to continue sort of their practices. And as you'll see in the reading for this week, you start to really see this intermingling of Jewish culture and Greek culture, and to maybe to generalize, we might say the Ptolemies allowed Jewish culture and Greek culture to exist side by side. There wasn't, the Ptolemies didn't feel a great threat from Jewish culture. The Seleucids, on the other hand, did not have the same sort of Mr. Rogers kind of tact. But really, under the Seleucids, we start to see what is called a Hellenization, or a forced Hellenization project onto the Judeans. And when we're talking about Hellenization, we're talking about the adaptation of Greek culture. So the word Hellene is the word for Greek. So Hellenization is sort of Greekification. And under the Seleucids, we have this forced Greekification process, which brings us to our all other cultural reference here, Lord Voldemort from the Harry Potter lore. If you are unfamiliar with the Harry Potter canon, Lord Voldemort is the great evil wizard who wants to sort of stamp out humans, that human culture is no good, wizard culture needs to take over. And so we can think of Antiochus Epiphanes as sort of the figurehead of the Seleucids. We're going to read about Antiochus next week for this class. So in 167, Antiochus goes into the Jerusalem temple, plunders it, and institutes this forced Hellenization process. And in this forced Hellenization process, rather than sort of hoping that Greek culture and Jewish culture are going to exist side by side, the forced Hellenization project is going to try and stamp out those unique aspects of Jewish culture, namely those things like monotheism, the Torah, circumcision, and the temple. And we're going to read about this in First Maccabees, this sort of forced Hellenization process that was forced onto Judeans by Antiochus Epiphanes for next week. And so once again, under the Seleucids, we don't have a Jewish king. That's going to change after the Seleucids for a very brief period with the Hasmoneans, which we'll read about a little bit for next week. So as to our empires and the sort of exile situation, we have the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Ptolemies, and the Seleucids. So it's alphabetical order of what I originally sort of asked you to order chronologically, making it sort of a mnemonic to remember that we have Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Ptolemies, and Seleucids in alphabetical order there. But what does this all mean for the New Testament? So we've sort of done this flyover approach to the imperial situation of Israel and the Judeans before the time that any of the New Testament documents were written. So why does this matter for the New Testament? For one, Jews and Israelites have had a long history of subjection, that being under other empires and being under the threat of their sort of culture and religiosity being stamped out in some way has always been a very real threat to Israel, to Judeans and Jews. And secondly, and more sort of pertinent to what we're going to be looking at with the texts of the New Testament themselves, is we see a number of different cultural influences that have a back history to them. That we don't just come to the New Testament without the history behind it influencing what we have in the New Testament. So when we come to the New Testament, we have this sort of whole history of Jewish and Israelite culture that intermingles with Greek culture. And what we'll see next week is that Jewish culture and Greek culture intermingled in different ways, and different Jewish people and different Jewish groups interacted with Greek culture in different ways. Some were more assimilating to Greek culture, and some were more resistant to Greek culture. And then when we get to the New Testament context itself, we have another imperial situation with the Romans, who we'll talk about in weeks 2 and 3 of this class. And this is, even though we have sort of these complex overlapping cultures here, this is even too simplistic of a way to think about early Christianity, but it helps us think about how early Christianity is situated between these various cultures and is influenced by these different cultures. And you'll notice here that in the middle of the Greek, Jewish, and Roman culture, early Christianity is but one circle, of which there would be many other circles. One of the things we'll talk a lot about in this class is how Judaism is not a monolith in the ancient world, nor is it a monolith today. There is not one Judaism in the New Testament context, but there are Judaisms. There are different expressions of Jewish belief, and the different cultures that sort of come together to form early Christianity is very complex. What we might call an intersexual way, or intersectional way of thinking about culture, religion, and any number of other kind of sociological factors. That these cultures are coming together and expressing themselves in different in ways that are both competing and compatible with one another. And so to finish up here, we're going to do one more lecture pause. So we're going to return to the lecture pause that we did at the beginning of this video. And I'm going to ask you to write the following empires in their chronological order. So this is your second take on doing this activity, and this will hopefully sort of confirm in your mind those neurological pathways of the different empires that stand behind the New Testament context. But then I want you to take it one step further and in 2 sentences or so, briefly articulate why this matters, why these imperial situations are relevant for our understanding of and reading of the New Testament.